Family did well. No?
Yep, thank you. Thanks. Right.
Okay. Ready?
Do I need to move one over?
Good afternoon. I'm Betsy Carr. Welcome you here today to the Subcommittee meeting of Higher Education of Appropriations. Thought this first is our first meeting. I'd like to thank Nick Rush, who was the previous Subcommittee chairman. He's stepped out for a minute, but just want to recognize his work in this committee. And just briefly, we can just have everybody introduce themselves, starting at that end. Elliot Austin.
I'm sorry.
Introduce yourself.
Just introduce yourself.
You just did. Mr. Madam Chairman, I'm Terry Halston, 19th House District.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Kirk Cox, 66th District, which is Chesterfield and Colonial Heights.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Cliff Hayes represents 77th District, which is Chesapeake, and a small portion of Virginia Beach.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair. Chris Hurst, 12th District. That encompasses most of the New River Valley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jay Jones, 89th District, part of the City of Norfolk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. David Reed, representing the 32nd District, which is the eastern part of Loudoun County.
Thank you. Today we have a brief agenda, but not importance, a very important overview of higher education by our staff member, Tony Maggio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since we do have a lot of new members, I thought it would be helpful to start off to give all of you sort of a primer, if you will, on higher education. There are a lot of terms, there's a lot of terminology. It kind of flies back and forth. I think it would help give you some context as we have our conversations, and then also just look at the state of funding at this particular point. So in higher education, you'll often hear various program names, and there are three major ones. There's the Education in General program, and that's been the focus of guidelines. That's the major program that they have. It's supported by both general fund and non-general fund. The non-general fund primarily are tuition and fees. Then there's the auxiliary enterprises. There's no general fund in auxiliary enterprise. That's totally self-supporting. Again, mainly by fees, but also TV revenues, sales and services, things of that nature. It's bookstores, it's dorms, it's the food service, it's the athletics, which was, obviously something that consumes a good part of the fees, the student unions, the parking program, things like that. And then there's the sponsored programs. Sponsored programs is primarily the research activities, overwhelmingly funded by the feds. There has been some state money in that state general fund that we have put in over the last few years. Again, each of these will be separate items under an institution. And one more point I just wanted to make here too. Sometimes institutions will point out, and I don't know who they are, that they're only 10% of the budget is general fund. That's when you take everything into account, which includes all those 100% non-general fund activities. You really, when they do that, you really ought to ask them, what's your E&G percentage? That's a little bit different. Not saying it's tremendously better, but at least it's a little bit more accurate representation of where the general fund is supposed to be. So now within E&G, within the education in general, there's the single largest component is instruction. And that's your undergraduate, graduate, the first professional programs. There are also some other programs in there too. There's community education. These are non-credit programs. It's done across the board, not just at the community colleges, but even at the senior institutions. And they all will play some part in that. Some of them smaller than others, but they all have a component. Also, there's the family practice. Family practice is a separate program. It's monies that have been put in for the medical schools related to their doctors. Under the research program, which is a standalone program, there's a research component, not the sponsored. These are more state-supported research centers. You'll see them, for example, at VCU, the Center for Public Policy. At UVA, it's going to be the Center for Politics, for example. You have a handful of those. There used to be more years ago, far fewer right now. And then finally, there's the public service. That's 100% non-general fund. Those are outreach programs, public lecture series, things like that. Again, they are 100% self-supporting. No general fund theoretically supports those programs. Those are the direct programs. If you ever hear, sometimes they'll refer to the three legs of the stool. That's the research, public service, and the instruction. That's the direct costs of the E&G. The indirect costs begin with the support programs. One of the largest is academic support. Is this the provost area? Academic computing, the libraries, things like that. Student services. It's the counseling, financial aid, administration, the registrar, admissions. Institutional support, this would be is the next, and this would be the pure administration. This is going to be your fiscal, your budget office, the accounting, things like that, HR, campus police, and then O&M plant, and you'll see some requests, for example, O&M for new buildings. This is what they're referring to. These are the costs to heat the buildings, to maintain those buildings, to put some of the custodial work that's in there, maintain the grounds, et cetera. So again, we have this general fund, non-general fund mix of monies. And so how do we know how much general fund to put into an institution? The biggest driver of that is going to be the proportion of in-state students. We have a goal for in-state students. That's the 67% goal, that we want to fund 2/3 of the cost of their education. And then for out-of-state students, back in the early 90s, we actually subsidized them, but around 91, 92, then Governor Wilder at the time, in response to the recession that we were in, said that we weren't going to be subsidizing out-of-state students, so they were required to pay 100%, at least 100%, of the cost of their education. We'll see here shortly. They pay far greater than 100%. So just to keep that in mind. Then there's some program mixes that also will impact the fund split. Again, to the degree that you have research and public service, that's programs 102 and 103. They have a large non-general fund component. In the community education, the indirect costs, those support services, are supposed to be supported from fees that are generated by those programs. So that will drive it, plus the actual out-of-state revenues will drive it. So this table kind of gives you a sense. This is the latest, and it's ranked ordered in terms of fund split. So as you can see, Richard Bland has the highest general fund split at 63.6%, but they also have one of the highest in-state proportion of students, almost 95%. The community colleges have a larger in-state population. Their fund split's a little bit smaller, in part because they have a significant, on the community education side of the house, a large program in that. And so they go down. Just point out just a couple of others. VCUs, while their in-state proportion is fairly large, their research and public service programs and the community education program is also fairly significant. Two others to point out. You see Mary Washington right now at 8.5%. At one time, and not too long ago, they were 30% out of state. They were 70 in-state, 30 out of state. So their enrollment hasn't changed very much in total. The mix of their enrollment has changed significantly, and that's driven a significant requirement for us to put more general fund in. They were losing students that were paying 150 to 200% of cost and being replaced with in-state students who are picking up 40% of cost, 30-some% of cost. There was and the requirement of us to put some of the general fund money up. So student mix does drive the fund split. So in 2018, and there's a lot of numbers here, but I'm going to try to distill it for you as best I can. What staff did was staff looked at the spending in 2018. It looked at the total enrollment in 2018. It weighted the various student groups. Undergraduates were given a weight of 1 because that's the standard. Graduate students were given a weight of 2, mainly because if you look at the student-faculty ratios, the classes tend to be smaller. So to teach one graduate class, actually there are fewer students being supported by one faculty member. Or on the undergraduate side, you might have 40, 50 students in a class or 20, 30 students in a class. On the graduate side, you may have 10 to 15 students in a class. So it's a more expensive program to run. Weighted those students and then divided that weighted number into the spending. So the FTE, that's full-time equivalent, so that assumes basically a 30 credit hour student, so it's by credit hours there. That's the spending per cost. That's the equivalent of the undergraduate cost to teach one full-time student at each of these institutions. So as you can see, they tend to cluster around $13,000, $14,000. There are a couple of outliers. Old Dominion on the low side, fairly low side, in part because they've tried to keep a lot of their costs lower. They do have a large component of graduate students, but their cost structure is fairly modest relative to some of their peers. On the high side, you see UVA and William & Mary. UVA driven primarily by the fact that they do generate far more revenues from their out-of-state students. They have the resources. They will spend those resources. So that's what's driving there. And then institutions like William & Mary and VMI, and to some degree, both of them, they're so small that there are some costs that you're going to incur, whether you're a large institution, small institution. You're going to have a president, you're going to have a VP, you're going to have a budget office. So it's just being spread over a smaller student body. So they're not as, if you will, efficient, if you will, on spreading some of those costs. But most institutions tend to cluster, as you could see, in the 13,000, 14,000 range across the system. The next column over is the general fund support that we provide for each of those students at each of those institutions. I'll point out a few things here. The top 6 institutions in general fund support have been the top 6 institutions, not necessarily in the same order, for as far back as I can go in terms of data. WISE, Virginia State, Norfolk State, VMI, William & Mary, and UVA have had the highest per dollar general fund support far back as I can go. The bottom 6 institutions have been the bottom 6 institutions, again, for as far back as I can go. JMU, Mason, Longwood, Radford have been pretty much the bottom 4 institutions, with Longwood and CNU not that far behind. And the middle 3 institutions, Old Dominion, VCU, and Tech, have tended to be the middle 3 institutions for quite some time. Old Dominion's moved up a little bit in the last few years, getting some extra general fund, but generally speaking, they have been where they are. The things that have fluctuated over time has been what institutions have done with their in-state and out-of-state on their tuition side. And as you could see, for example, an institution like Old Dominion gets 90% of the revenue that they derive is derived from their in-state undergraduate students. Only 10% are coming from out-of-state. They don't have a large out-of-state population. Similarly, VCU is in a similar boat. The institutions with the high out-of-state populations, like UVA, Tech, William & Mary, JMU, although theirs has been dropping significantly, VMI, they have a little bit more flexibility in what they do. But many of our institutions are not in that realm. Institutions that have shifted over time, as I pointed out, Mary Washington has shifted. Their overall used to be 30%. Undergraduates, as you can see, are down to 9. They have some graduate programs. George Mason, the opposite way. They used to be much lower on the out-of-state side. They have managed in recent years to attract more out-of-state students to their institution, which provides them greater revenue. Again, so going to the next slide, we look at those weighted costs for for each institution, rather the weighted revenues that are driven by between their graduates and their undergraduates. So for example, the Old Dominion 14,400, that's driven by 90% of it is driven by the in-state, only 10% by the out-of-state. But those are the weighted revenues. And now, as you could see, every institution is driving enough revenues from the mix of in-state, out-of-state, and general fund to cover at least 100% of their costs. Some are closer to the margin than others. JMU is right at the margin. They're at 101%, whereas, again, based on this, William & Mary is at 150%. The revenues that they drive from their in- and out-of-state students, along with their general fund, covers their undergraduate costs plus 50%. There's cross-subsidization that'll take place. They will talk to you about how some of those monies go to support the graduate programs and other aspects of what are going on, but this is just to give you some sense. The undergraduate programs do pay for themselves when you combine all these resources. Most of it is coming now from the tuition side, and as you can see for the far right-hand column, the out-of-state students, the out-of-state tuition fees as a percentage of that weighted cost is anywhere from 150 to over 200%. So at the very top of the heap, George Mason, for example, they generate from their tuition and fees and out-of-state students, that's equivalent to 218% of the unit cost that they have. On the lower end of that scale, for example, are going to be Norfolk State and Virginia State that generate only about 115 to 118%. Some institutions have more revenue elasticity they're able to charge than others. Okay, I'm sorry, I should have skipped that slide. That was when I was just talking on it. You might have it in front of you. My apologies. 6-year plans. Back in 2011, there was a proposal to create a 6-year planning process. That came out of conversations with institutions that kept telling us, we're doing more planning. The state's not recognizing that. You need to recognize the planning that we're doing. So we put together a process called the 6-year plan process. It became part of in 2011, what was then the top jobs legislation, and it required the institutions to turn in both an academic financial, a tuition, an enrollment plan to show exactly what was going on over the next 2 years. In 2019, in the odd number year, we do a full-blown plan. This summarizes the results of that. So for institutions, their top priority are faculty and staff salaries. I think you probably all have heard of the Unified Amendment that's come out. I think all the presidents have signed off on that. But what they would say is that about $60 million of the $190 million total spending that are in their 6-year plan, $60 million of that is related to faculty and staff salaries. The next priority, although not dollar amount, but the next priority, financial aid, another $30 million. For many institutions, for some institutions, that's general fund that they're looking for. For several other institutions, we'll get into this shortly, it's the raising of tuition to use for financial aid has been something in the last few years that has grown in popularity as they use it as a tool to help on their affordability. Base operating costs, things like utilities, O&M, et cetera, 37 million. And then there are a host of institution-specific initiatives totaling about $64 million. Financial aid is another program that's out there. It's separate from E&G, and there are two major forms of financial aid. There's grants and there's loans. The major grant program is going to be Pell. That's federally funded. The state program, and there's an appropriation, and we'll touch base in a little more detail shortly on that, is the state program. It's the Virginia Guaranteed Assistance Program, VGAP, or the Commonwealth Award. You'll hear both of those. And the institutions also, as I pointed out, will provide some aid through the use of tuition and in some cases through their endowments. The loan programs, again, overwhelmingly federal programs, Stafford and Plus. There are some private loans. To qualify for financial aid, you have to fill out a FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. The percentage of students that are filing a FAFSA As you see, in 2004, it was about 51% of the students at the 4 years filed it. In 2018, 65% of the students filed a FAFSA. We have tried to keep up. State general fund at the four-year institutions since 2004 is increased over 200%. However, during that time, the growth in tuition grew 76%, while the average award only grew by 72%. Tuition is growing faster than the average award than we can keep up with on the financial aid side. And the story at the community colleges is similar. Again, total general fund for financial aid has increased over 340% since 2004, but the average award has grown by only 114% compared to 141. The reason even for the growth here, in part, is recall, since around 2011, 2012, enrollment at community colleges has dropped by about 30,000 students. So you have far fewer students that potentially were taking up some of the awards, so that money has been able to be spread differently. But again, it's still the growth in the tuition is still there. Here's the total general undergraduate general fund for state financial aid. The amount that was out there, this is just prior to this particular budget coming out, but it was $223 million. The allocations were based on a methodology that was in place back in the 80s. In 2019, you directed Chev to review the methodology, review the award policies, review the use of aid. This past year, I'm sure that you've seen some of the press releases, but Chev did go back. They made some, I think, very important changes. They changed the focus of aid from it being chasing tuition and fee growing costs, and now it is more focused on expected family contribution, which is a proxy. So the money is theoretically being allocated to institutions for students with greater or with who have fewer resources and ability to pay. So this allocates the low and middle income students that we've been trying to address. Understand, these allocations are simply that. They're an allocation that Chev makes a recommendation for. The actual award is done by those financial aid administrators at each institution. Each institution has its own set of rules. So you'll hear the terms like whether they spread the peanut butter thin or thicker, whether they put larger grants to a smaller group of students or try to get more students and perhaps smaller grants. They're far more adept at figuring out what they're supposed to do. They try to put packages together. I would never try to second guess them. They have a tough job, but they make those decisions at the institutional level. So the use of tuition for financial aid since 2012, it's increased. So compared the two 6-year plans, the one we had in 2012 and the one we had in fiscal 19. It's increased by 153%. As you can see, some startling increases. UVA's gone from $15 million to $32 million. They have almost 20% of their tuition revenue is now dedicated to financial aid. William & Mary, 19%. Mary Washington has gone from about 1% to almost 19%, $6 million. Again, they will tell you that they have to do that because they're trying to obviously attract students to keep them there, and also they are now dealing with more in-state students. The two HBCUs are at 11 and 12%. As you'll see it at the next slide, that is troubling because the vast majority of the students are students with need. So they're charging students 12% more, whereas almost every student at their institution has some level of need. And so the efficacy of that is somewhat questionable, something that we may want to have a talk about as to how we use our financial aid policy to perhaps help their students and reduce some of the burden there. So again, the institutions, it's grown over time. This is what I want to talk about. So again, 5 institutions, 10% or more. As you could see, at Mary Washington, 20%, about 48% of the students have need. UVA and William & Mary have roughly 20%, but the students with need are in the 30 to 40% range. At VSU and NSU, 13% and roughly 10%, 92% of their undergraduates, in-state students, have need. That's kind of a fairly, rough equation in which to get through. Others have been growing over time, and so really it's just more a matter of, I think, that the General Assembly needs to start looking at, is the practice sustainable? Have we reached a point where we're having to put more and more in, and we're not really making any headway with it? Is it practical? Should there be some limits? Some states, Iowa used to have a high proportion of their tuition used for financial aid. Their Board of Governors, it was called the Board of Governors, which they had a single board, basically voted to do away with the practice, and they've actually gone the other way. It's just something, I'm not saying do away, but I think there maybe needs to be some bumpers on the road. Student debt. Again, we've talked about this once before. It's growing nationally, 1.6 trillion nationally, 45 million borrowers. At the very bottom, the slide, while the proportions are very similar, the average debt at our public institutions, according to data from College Insight, is slightly higher than the national average, 30,300 compared to 27,800. And so that's something that we want to keep an eye on. This maybe gives a little bit more context. In 2004 at public institutions, the public 4 years, 47% of the undergraduates had borrowing. About 50,000 students, they borrowed about $293 million. In 18, it's about 74,000 or 54% of the students, and their borrowing now is almost $770 million. Average borrowing has jumped from $5,800 to $10,300. Again, I pointed out before the loan programs, overwhelmingly federal programs at the 4 years, and the question is the same, or the answer is the same at the 2-year institutions. And then lastly, the tuition assistance grant program. I wanted to point out that is a program that provides general fund support not to the private institutions, but to the residents, to Virginia resident students who are attending those institutions. The program's been around since, I believe, late 60s, early 70s. The original intent was to reduce some of the enrollment pressure on the public institutions. It serves about 22,000 students as in 2020. It is not a need-based program. It wasn't meant to be. It was basically meant to mirror the general fund subsidy that goes to the public institutions. While it's not need-based, as I pointed out during the briefing, overall, about 3/4 of the students receiving TAG grants are from low and middle income families. That's the profile. And if the program starts to change and those students start to decide to go on to public institutions or whatever, as you see the general fund support, it goes $7,000, $8,000 compared to $3,400 to $4,000. So it's going to cost you twice as much for each student just for the subsidy alone. So it's something just to keep in mind as you're looking at the program. Madam Chair, that is all I had. I'm happy to answer any questions. I just wanted to give you all at least something to context for, I think, for a session.
Thank you, Mr. Maggio. Any questions from members? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Tony, going back to slide 3 under E and G, under instruction, community ed, and non-credit training.
Yes.
What type of examples would something like that fall under? I'm trying to think of.
I'm going to have to get some of the detail on that. I don't have a specific program readily available. There are.
So for software skills, but they are non-credit.
Is that credentialing?
Pardon?
Is that credentialing?
No. This is, again, there are programs that some of the institutions will engage in that they work within their local communities, and they will provide the instruction. There's a direct cost, and then the indirects come from the fees that are derived from the program that they will offer in response to needs from the community. I'd have to get you some specific programs on that, Mr. Hayes, and I will do so.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you. Any last words?
No, ma'am.
So, thank you. That adjourns our committee. We will meet again next Monday at this time.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.